Once again, I'm here to talk to you about Calderón de la Barca's magnificent Vida, Sueño. For those of you who follow the channel, you'll know that approximately a month ago, we made a video on this work, and when I published and edited that video, I honestly thought it would be the last I make of the work, but it's too profound, it's too great, and it's too, frankly, genius not to talk about again. And specifically, this time that I read it, I learned a whole lot more about poetic forms used in the Spanish Baroque. And that's what I want to discuss today. This work is too genius to simply make one video about. The specific part I'm actually talking about doesn't occur long after the part that I referred to in the most recent video. Just to jog your memory a bit, in the most recent video, I spoke about Rosaura's famous monologue that opens up the play. Now, shortly after this monologue, Rosaura and Clarín, her servant, come across a small castle, a fortification, and they hear a voice crying out from the depths of this fortification. It's a dark, clouded night, and the combination of all these factors is pretty terrifying. And so Rosaura goes on to paint a picture of her own fear. And that's what I want to talk about today, because for any of you who love theater, who love language, who love literature, who love history, there's actually quite a lot that we can learn from this particular dialogue of Rosaura's. It's full of powerful imagery, particularly full of antithesis. But so, to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, I'm going to quickly read out the particular excerpt I'm talking about. No es breve luz aquella, caduca exhalación, pálida estrella, que en trémulos desmayos, pulsando ardores y latiendo rayos, hace más tenebrosa la oscura habitación con luz dudosa. Si pues a sus reflejos puedo determinar, aunque de lejos, una prisión oscura que es de un vivo cadáver sepultura. ¿Y por qué más me asombre? En el traje de fiera yace un hombre, de prisiones cargado y solo de una luz acompañado. Pues huir no podemos, desde aquí sus desdichas escuchemos, sepamos lo que dice. Essentially, Rosaura is expressing the terror of hearing this voice. She also mentions how she can discern that the voice is coming from a man in chains, and that she and Clarín should stay behind in order to hear what this man says. Now, this man happens to be Segismundo, the deuteragonist of this play. And what leads and follows is probably the most famous part of La Vida y Sueño, and this just goes to show, in neither of these videos am I even covering the most famous, the most iconic part of La Vida y Sueño, and yet there's so much that we can make entire videos about it. It just goes to show the depth and the profundity of so many of these Siglo de Oro works. And as I said, it's something we as Spanish enthusiasts, as Spanish speakers, as Spanish students should just frankly pay a lot more attention to, because the richness that we can mine from these works is incomparable. What I found particularly interesting about this, and perhaps those of you who are a little bit more acquainted with poetry will have already picked out, this has got a pretty simple rhyming scheme. It's an AABB rhyming scheme. And in trying to investigate a little bit more about this rhyming scheme, I actually found that the whole metric structure of this is a metric structure called the Silva. And the Silva, it turns out, is the predominant metric structure that playwrights and poets used in the Spanish Siglo de Oro. One of the reasons for this seems to be that it had a degree of flexibility in its metric structure that made space for the numerous diphthongs that occur in the Spanish language and that weren't really that present in Latin. And it is indeed in Latin that we actually find the first example of the Silva. Publius Papinius Estacius was the first to popularize the Silva, and in fact, the whole metric system is named after one of his works, the Silvas, which was the Latin word for forest. It was adopted in Spanish literature by most poets, but it was particularly popularized by Luis de Góngora in the 17th century. And so it's not surprising at all that we see Calderón de la Barca using it. What's particularly interesting about this is that, as you may have noticed, the Silva is a strophe composed of, in Spanish, indecasílabos, 11 syllables, and heptasílabos, 7 syllables. So what we have is a case where sometimes the first verse will be in heptasílabos and then the following will be in endecasílabos. And you can actually see that if you go back and listen to this poem, there's usually a long verse followed by a short verse, long verse, short verse, and each of those are A, B, etc. Now, I'm not particularly good at poetry itself. In fact, this is the first time that I'm really diving into the mechanics of poetry in Spanish or in any language, really, and perhaps that's a bit more my fault than anything else. But what I do want to draw attention to here is the imagery, the metaphor that Rosaura uses. And this is kind of interesting because, of course, metaphor is the motor of a lot of fiction. Aristotle, in both his rhetorics and his poetics, speaks extensively about metaphor. Now, he had a much broader sense of metaphor than we have, which would actually encompass the kind of antithesis, the juxtaposition that I'm interested in here. And what I'll do is I'll show you some of the interesting examples. Rosaura talks about un vivo cadáver sepultura. The whole verse is que es de un vivo cadáver sepultura. It is the sepulchre of a living cadaver. And what I love is the power of that antithesis, the power of that oxymoron is joining together two different things that are conventionally considered complete opposites. But as Aristotle says in his description of metaphor and a whole variety of figures of speech, what these do is, by using this clever play of words, it forces us as the audience to start thinking carefully about what it means. On a logical level, perhaps at first sight, it seems to be completely illogical. How can a cadaver be alive, and how can a living cadaver be buried? Of course, the point here is that Calderón de la Barca is, through the beauty of his words, causing us to start reflecting on ideas such as freedom, autonomy, and bondage, both metaphorical and, in this passage, pretty literal. The context for this, of course, is that the man whom Rosaura is talking about, Segismundo, is literally chained up in a tower. And why is a long story that you have to be a bit more acquainted with the play to understand. But I really love this idea, vivo cadáver sepultura. I think perhaps it sometimes makes us ourselves wonder about whether we might not be vivos cadáveres sepulturas. There are some other great examples of juxtaposition that I want to bring out here. And I think any Spanish speaker or any Spanish student should try and incorporate this kind of language in any of the writing they do. Maybe that's a bit of a tall order, but aim for the stars and land among the moon, right? Rosaura talks about a pálida estrella, a pale star. Now, I don't think pálida in this sense means pale in the sense of complexion, but rather pale in the sense of strength of light, right? In the same sense that in English we might talk about someone being pallid to the point nearly of appearing dead. She also talks about how this pálida estrella, this star, hace más tenebrosa la obscura habitación con luz dudosa. It makes the dark room even darker with a doubtful light. I just think that's such an amazing juxtaposition. We've seen the juxtaposition between life and death, and here also the oxymoron or antithesis between light and dark. And Calderón de la Barca, throughout this extract, is constantly playing with these different themes. One last oxymoron before we leave is going to be en el traje de fiera yace un hombre. In the clothing of a beast, a man lies. This distinction between beast and man, which of course reflects the state that Segismundo finds himself in, not having the dignity of a human being, but forced to live like an animal in a stable. There are more things I could talk about here, but that would probably risk running this video far too long. So I'm going to leave it here, and once again, finish off with a strong encouragement, an exhortation to all of you to pick up Calderón de la Barca's La Vida y Sueño. If you are studying Spanish, if you're a Spanish student, if you speak Spanish, this is an unmissable work. It's difficult perhaps to get your hands on the first time. I didn't really understand it fully the first time either, but once you become comfortable with it, there are treasures to be mined from it. And every time you progress through the work with a sufficient critical and poetic lens, you can't help but be surprised by the sheer genius of someone like Pedro Calderón de la Barca.